Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Dr. Maya Ellison. Today, we're stepping back from the headlines and the theatrics to ask the questions that linger long after the cameras left. About Ted Bundy, yes, but more importantly, about victims, families, and the systems that failed them. This episode is somber. It's difficult. If you need a moment at any time, please take one. Today, I'm joined by Detective Samuel Ortiz, retired homicide detective and former cold case unit supervisor who worked major cases across the Pacific Northwest in the 1980s and 1990s. Sam, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Maya. It's hard to find the right words for this one, but I appreciate the chance to talk about what we still don't know and what we should never stop asking.
Sam, before we get into the messy details and the unanswered pieces, I want to set the frame. This is not a rerun of Bundy's crimes as spectacle, no glorification. We'll use the documented timeline as a backbone, but we're orbiting the problem. How many crucial questions remain unresolved? Why did institutions stumble? Whose lives are still unaccounted for? Ready?
Ready?
Okay. Let's begin at the start, or what we think is the start. Theodore Robert Cowell, later known as Ted Bundy, born November 24th, 1946. Early childhood wrapped in secrecy, raised to believe his grandparents were his parents, his mother, his sister. His surname changed to Bundy after his mother's marriage. These family deceptions are often repeated in profiles. But Sam, do we know if that family story actually matters to the killing, or does it become a tidy origin myth?
Great question. Short answer, we don't know. Long answer, it's complicated. People like simple origin stories, something to blame or to explain. In the Bundy case, that secrecy is a narrative that interviewers and writers seized on. But in investigations, I see two things. One, childhood instability can matter for developmental trajectories. Two, a lot of people with messy childhoods never commit violent crimes. So I'd caution against a causal leap. It's suggestive, not conclusive.
Right. Suggestive, not deterministic. I'll push on that because a lot of public understanding of serial offenders wants a single cause. The record shows some reports of early disturbing acts, anecdotes about knives placed near family members, glimpses of cruelty, yet these are often secondhand, decades later. Sam, as an investigator, how reliable are those anecdotal patches when you're trying to reconstruct motive or timeline?
Anecdotes are clues, Maya, not evidence. They tell us what to look for, but by themselves, they're not enough. In the Bundy file, those early stories should have prompted closer scrutiny at the time. But 1960s police culture didn't always treat such reports as serious. And memories change. People conflate, embellish, understandably, when a notorious figure is revealed. We have to treat those stories carefully.
Okay, moving forward, Bundy as a young adult, college at the University of Washington, a psychology degree in 1972, volunteering on a suicide crisis hotline, political campaigns, work at the State Department of Emergency Services, where he helped search for missing women. It reads like a contradiction, caring roles and atrocious crimes. Sam, did his outward life help him evade detection?
Absolutely. That was part of the problem. He presented as intelligent, polite, involved in community work. He even volunteered for rescue efforts, material that, in an investigation, can be camouflage or opportunism. In the 70s, without centralized databases and rapid cross-jurisdictional communication, someone who looked normal could slip between disappearances and simply not trigger a pattern flag quickly enough.
which brings us to 1974, the cluster of attacks and disappearances in Washington. We usually mark the beginning of the recognized series in January 1974 with the attack on Karen Sparks, sometimes called Joni Lenz, an assault that left her with permanent brain injury. Then Lynda Healy in February, a wave of missing college women through spring and summer. Sam, what's striking to you about that early sequence?
What's striking and chilling is the variety of settings and methods. Abductions from houses, killings in isolated areas, disappearances from bars and campuses. He was brazen. The Lake Sammamish abductions in July 1974, 2 women taken in broad daylight from a crowded park, are a turning point. That level of audacity should have set off alarms quickly, but instead it became part of a pattern that wasn't fully connected until later.
I want to pause on Lake Sammamish. Janice Ott and Denise Naslund vanish in daylight. Witnesses reported an attractive man, arm in a fake cast, a tan Volkswagen. It's an archetype now: charm, the fake injury, the vehicle. But those composite sketches were publicized early. Still, Bundy kept operating. Why weren't those leads producing a faster capture?
Jurisdictional fragmentation, for one. These cases were handled by different agencies: Seattle PD, county sheriffs, campus police, with limited ability to cross-reference investigations. And the culture of the time dismissed some missing women as runaways. Let's be blunt, sexism played a role. Reports about young women disappearing were often minimized, treated as non-violent departures. That delay cost lives. It's an uncomfortable truth, but it's true.
Uncomfortable and infuriating. Part of what we want to do today is not only catalog mistakes, but honor the victims left unaccounted for. Before we go into Utah and Colorado, I want to ask you, Bundy himself suggested earlier violence, perhaps as early as 1969. How credible is that claim, and how does that feed the question, how many victims were there really?
His claims are mixed. Bundy liked to manipulate timelines. Sometimes he admitted to things, sometimes he withheld details, always on his own terms. When he suggested earlier offenses, investigators took note and tried to map unsolved cases from that period. Some unsolved homicides fit his pattern: young women, similar methods, but without concrete physical evidence or his confession details, we can't definitively attribute them. The true count could be higher than the 30 he confessed to. It could also be inflated in rumor. The honest answer is, we don't know.
That "we don't know" sits at the core of this episode. Bundy confessed to at least 30 murders in states across the West and the Mountain South, and investigators suspect numbers could be far higher, possibly dozens more. If you were leading a modern cold case unit, Sam, how would you go about re-examining potential Bundy links now?
You start with DNA, period. Modern forensic DNA techniques, mitochondrial, touch DNA, genetic genealogy, have solved cases older than Bundy's cluster. You re-examine preserved evidence, hairs, fibers, trace evidence. Then you map travel patterns, his known addresses, employment, and car registrations to establish where he was when. You also cross-reference missing person reports that were never fully investigated. But the big constraint is evidence preservation. If the physical trace is gone, we have to rely on witness statements and circumstantial links, which are weaker.
Evidence preservation, an important point. In many sites where victims' remains were later found, animals, weather, and time complicated recovery. Sites like Taylor Mountain and Issaquah yielded intermingled fragments that were hard to attribute. That scattering feeds uncertainty about victim counts and identities. Before we dive deeper into forensics, we need to talk about the 1974-1975 expansion to Utah and Colorado. This is when the pattern follows him as he moves. Carol Durant's survival is pivotal. Sam, can you tell us why her story mattered so much in investigators' eyes?
Carol Durant is the reason Bundy was first prosecuted for kidnapping in Utah. She fought back. She escaped and later identified him in a lineup. She described the fake cop routine, the handcuffs, the VW. From an investigative standpoint, her survivor testimony linked his car and MO across state lines. It also gave prosecutors probable cause to hold him. Without Durant, the case against him in Utah would have been far weaker early on.
And yet, even after the Utah conviction for kidnapping in 1976, and while Bundy was in custody, he managed to escape twice in 1977. I want listeners to hear how these escapes happened because they underline systemic failures. The first escape, Aspen, he jumped from a courthouse library window during pretrial motions. The second escape, a month later, in Glenwood Springs, he sawed a hole in his cell's ceiling, slipped through ducts, and walked out. Sam, how do you evaluate those failures?
They were catastrophic errors. The Aspen escape reflects a risk assessment failure. Bundy was a high-profile defendant with resources and courtroom savvy. Giving him unshackled access to a second-story window with insufficient guard coverage was a mistake. The Glenwood Springs escape was worse. A facility with poor architectural control, weak head counts, and an inmate who'd been allowed too much unsupervised access. You can explain why with the context of the era, small local jails, different standards, but those explanations don't absolve responsibility. Families of later victims were right to be outraged.
Outrage is a mild word, because after the second escape, Bundy traveled to Florida and committed the Chi Omega attacks and the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. These deaths happened after opportunities to keep him confined. There's a moral and institutional responsibility question here. From a prosecutorial or departmental perspective, is there a mechanism to hold institutions accountable for lives taken after such lapses?
Civil suits, internal reviews, resignations, those are typical. But criminal accountability for negligence that leads to subsequent murders is rare. It's hard to prove direct legal causation. What we do in policing is learn. After Bundy, corrections and courts revised protocols, more careful custody decisions, stricter transport rules, better courthouse security. But that's small consolation for the families who lost loved ones because a defendant walked free.
Small consolation, indeed. Let's talk about the Florida spree in January-February 1978, Chi Omega sorority house, attacks on multiple young women, attacks on Cheryl Thomas, and Kimberly Leach's abduction from school grounds. Witnesses described the VW, a white van, in Leach's abduction, and officers in Pensacola later stopped a Beetle that led to Bundy's capture. The capture story has its own drama. Officer David Lee's traffic stop, the suspect's struggle, the eventual revelation, "I'm Ted Bundy." Sam, in law enforcement culture, how does a capture like that feel? Almost anticlimactic after months of terror.
It's a mix of relief and anger. Relief that the immediate threat is contained, anger at the lost time and missed opportunities. Officer Lee's stop was classic patrol work. Nothing glamorous, just attention to detail. But it's worth noting how many simple, mundane law enforcement actions ultimately solve big problems. The tragic part is how preventable some of the intervening deaths might have been if agencies had coordinated better earlier.
I want to pivot now to the trials, the Miami Chiomaga trial in 1979 and the Kimberly Leach trial in 1980. Both were high-profile, televised, and in many ways set precedents for the way serial killer trials were shown in public. But I want to focus on evidence. The Chiomaga trial relied heavily on bite mark evidence. Richard Suvavern's testimony that bite marks on Lisa Levy matched Bundy's dental impressions. In later decades, bite mark analysis became controversial. Sam, do you think that evidence was reliable then, and how do we judge it now?
At the time, bite mark analysis was seen as a cutting-edge forensic tool. Courts accepted it, and juries found it persuasive, graphic, tangible, easy to understand. Now we know it's fraught. Studies have shown high error rates, and several wrongful convictions hinged on bite mark testimony. That doesn't mean Bundy was innocent. The weight of the overall evidence is overwhelming, but the Bundy case did help legitimize a forensic method that later proved problematic. It's an uneasy legacy.
So we catch the right man, but perhaps lend credibility to a flawed tool that later sent innocent people to prison. The duality is chilling. And beyond bite marks, there was hair, fiber, and witness testimony. Survivors identified him. Witnesses placed him near scenes. Traces linked his VW to victims. Few experts doubt his guilt. Still, there are unanswered forensic questions. Were there victims he never admitted to? Are there remains still not identified?
Yes to both. Bundy's confessions late in life were incomplete and strategic. He gave details on some cases but withheld others, sometimes offering partial confessions in exchange for stays of execution. Families were often left with teasers, not closure. And because many remains were fragmentary and scattered, identification was sometimes impossible with the era's tools. Today, cold case labs would retest whatever biological material remains, but again, it depends on preservation and what the state kept.
Let's spend a segment on victims, because too often, books and shows reduce them to names on a list. I want to highlight a handful. Karen Sparks, survivor of the January 1974 attack, her life was permanently altered. Lynda Healy, taken from her house in February 1974, she loved the radio, skiing, her family was shattered. Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, taken in daylight at Lake Sammamish. Janice was newly married, Denise was a student. Karen Campbell, 23, a nurse, taken in Snowmass. And Kimberly Leach, a 12-year-old, taken from school grounds. Sam, when you investigate, how do you keep victims' humanity at the center rather than getting lost in the killer's psychology?
You force yourself to. Every file in a cold case locker is a life abruptly stopped. I keep a photo of each victim in the file and their family contacts. I talk to relatives about birthdays, jobs, hopes. Investigations that lose the personal context feel hollow. That's not why you do the work. Bringing a name, a face, a story back into public conversation is part of justice, procedural or otherwise.
Thank you. Mentioning survivors, Carol Duranch, as we said, escaped and testified. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler survived Chiomaga and later spoke publicly about reclaiming their lives. Cheryl Thomas survived in Tallahassee but lives with permanent injuries. Those survivors' voices are vital and often sidelined by the spectacle. Sam, do we have records of how those women fared later? Psychologically, socially? Did they get the support they needed?
Support in the 70s and 80s was spotty. Some received counseling and remained connected with advocacy groups, but systemic victim services were not as developed as today. Survivors often had to be resilient and find their own paths. Part of our job today is acknowledging that the system didn't always care for survivors adequately, and in many places, it still struggles.
That's important. Institutional responsibility extends beyond preventing crimes. It includes care after. Now, psychology. Bundy described an entity, an internal split between Ted and the killer. He also referenced violent porn in a Last Days interview with James Dobson. How should listeners weigh his explanations?
With skepticism, Bundy's narratives were manipulative, designed to control the story, to cast blame, sometimes to gain sympathy. The entity language is a distancing tactic. Clinically, he fits profiles of a psychopathic predator: superficial charm, lack of remorse, calculated behavior. Pornography may have been a stimulus for his fantasies, but it's a flimsy cause. Most people exposed to obscene material never kill. The origins are multifactorial: personality, opportunity, escalation, and deviant sexual interests, none of which excuse what he did.
So we resist simple cause and effect claims. We also have to wrestle with the cultural phenomenon, Bundy as a brand. The televised trials, his charisma, the courtship of female fans, this has morphed into decades of true crime output that sometimes romanticizes him. Sam, why does Bundy retain such magnetism in popular culture? And what are the risks?
He's a tidy paradox. Handsome, college-educated, articulate. People find that more frightening because it breaks the stereotype of the monstrous outsider. That novelty makes a compelling story. The risk is twofold. First, glorification can eclipse victims' humanity. Second, it can create a playbook for copycats or attract people who fetishize violence. Ethically, creators should center victims and avoid turning killers into celebrities.
Ethically center victims. That's exactly why we framed this episode around unanswered questions. Before we move toward closing, I want to address forensics again, specifically the bite mark issue, and what it teaches us about forensic science overall. The Bundy case helped legitimize odontology. Later, the method proved unreliable in multiple exonerations. How do we hold scientific disciplines accountable while recognizing their value in certain contexts?
Transparency and ongoing validation. Forensic methods should be subject to rigorous, peer-reviewed testing like any scientific technique. Courts should require documented error rates and standardized protocols. In the Bundy era, some disciplines raced ahead of scientific consensus. Today, we must insist on replicable science. That doesn't mean throw out all forensic evidence. It means contextualize and corroborate. Bite marks can be one piece, but they shouldn't be the sole linchpin.
Agreed. Context and corroboration. Now, let's spend a few minutes addressing the unanswered menu of the case, the things investigators, survivors, and families still wrestle with. First, how many victims? We've said numbers vary. 20 confirmed by remains, 30 plus confessed, 36 plus suspected in law enforcement estimates, and some investigators posit 50 to 100. What do those ranges mean in practice?
They mean uncertainty. Confirmed counts are conservative, what can be proven with remains, confessions, or incontrovertible links. Suspected counts include circumstantial possibilities. Bundy's own manipulation compounds the issue. Sometimes he claimed victims to bolster infamy, sometimes he withheld. Practically, cold case units use probabilistic approaches. Is this likely, possible, or improbable? They prioritize cases where evidence can be tested or where new information might meaningfully change the status.
Second, did the system let him keep killing? We've described sexism, interagency failure, escape lapses. Is there accountability, or is the lesson mostly institutional learning?
Mostly institutional learning. There were inquiries and reforms, but criminal liability for systemic lapses rarely pursued beyond internal discipline. The real accountability has to be cultural, training, databasing, and policy changes that prevent recurrence. We still need to be vigilant. Systems improve when people demand better.
Third, psychology and origin stories, born or made. You told us earlier the answer is messy. Multiple factors, no single smoking gun. Fourth, cultural fascination and ethical choices in storytelling. Fifth, family's closure. Some had it with his execution, some never did. Are there any practical steps families or investigators can take now to find answers?
Yes. If material evidence exists, submit it for modern DNA analysis. Reach out to state cold case units, which often accept tips or reopen files when new evidence emerges. Families can also petition for records, photographic evidence re-examination, and access to preserved materials. There are also nonprofit organizations that assist with forensic genealogy if appropriate. But it requires resources, persistence, and sometimes legal pressure.
That's concrete and helpful. I want to read a short quote from one of the major sources because words matter. In interviews compiled in The Only Living Witness, Bundy described the crimes in the third person, the killer, as separate. Quote, he described it as an entity inside him that was fascinated with the hunt, unquote. Sam, you've heard that line in many contexts, from other offenders and from subjects in interviews. How do investigators parse that language ethically?
We parse it as self-distancing and manipulation. Calling it an entity reduces personal responsibility. When we interrogate, we push for specifics. Dates, locations, names. Vague metaphors are red flags. They reveal posturing, not remorse. Clinicians might analyze it differently, but in police work, we keep pushing until the person can't hide behind rhetorical devices.
Let's pause. I want to acknowledge the emotional toll this conversation takes on survivors listening, on families live with uncertainty, on investigators carrying these images. It's heavy. Sam, what keeps you up at night about Bundy's case, even decades later?
What keeps me up is the unanswered where for some families, where a mother's remains are, the detail a sister won't ever get, the exact hour a husband last saw his wife alive. Also, the institutional whiffs, the escapes that felt preventable. Those are the parts that don't rest easy.
Same here. And for me, as a scholar focused on gender-based violence and media, it's the cultural afterlife, how some narratives re-centralize the killer and obscure the lived realities of the women he harmed. We have a duty to push back on that. Before we close, I want to offer listeners some practical steps. If you're a relative or an advocate with a cold case concern, contact your state police cold case unit or the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs. Seek out victim advocacy groups that help families navigate records and forensic options. And if you're a creator telling this story, center victims and survivors, avoid sensationalism, and interrogate your own motives.
And one more practical note. If you have artifacts, letters, photos, any documents from the 1970s related to missing persons, consider preserving them and offering copies to researchers. Sometimes the smallest detail, a date on a postcard, a bus ticket, can reset an investigation.
Good point. Before we sign off, can we spend 3 minutes on the legacy piece? How did Bundy change policing and cultural responses to serial violence? And what still needs to change? Sam?
He changed a lot. Bundy's case pushed agencies toward centralized databases, improved interjurisdictional communication, and more careful scrutiny of missing person reports. Behavioral profiling grew in prominence, but we still struggle with gender biases in policing, with resource allocation for missing adults who aren't wealthy or high profile, and with evidence preservation in smaller jurisdictions. The lessons are partial, and those gaps still cost us.
And culturally, our fascination remains, often framed as true crime entertainment rather than a public health crisis of gendered violence. We must ask, who benefits from retelling these stories? Is it survivors, or is it the market for lurid narratives? That question should guide creators and consumers.
Agreed.
All right, we'll end on this. Bundy's legal life closed with his execution on January 24, 1989. His body was cremated, ashes scattered in the Cascade Mountains. He's gone, but as this episode argues, the case is not closed. Questions persist about victim counts, unidentified remains, origins of his violence, and the accountability of institutions. We owe it to the people whose lives were taken and to survivors to keep those questions alive.
Maya, one last thing. For investigators and listeners who feel overwhelmed by this scale of harm, channel that feeling. Volunteer with victim support groups, donate to cold case efforts, or push your local agencies to improve missing person systems. Anger and grief can be catalysts for change.
Yes, turn feeling into action. Thank you, Sam, for this grim but vital conversation.
Thank you, Maya. It matters that we keep asking.
And thank you to listeners. If you want sources, memorials, or organizations to contact, we've compiled a list in the episode notes, resources for families, cold case units, and advocacy groups. This has been Still Unanswered with Dr. Maya Ellison and Detective Samuel Ortiz. I'm Maya. Take care of yourselves and of each other. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, remember the people behind the names.